This scary story happened to Sarah when she was home, alone. Her roommate Emily was always by her side, but one day she had to leave on a work trip. But first things first. It was a rainy Wednesday night, and Sarah was home, alone. Her roommate, Emily, had left earlier in the day for a work trip, and she wouldn't be back until the weekend. Sarah didn't mind the solitude. She enjoyed having the house to herself, especially at night when she could curl up on the couch with a glass of wine and a movie. It was around midnight when she first heard the sound. It began with a faint creak, barely noticeable at first, like the gentle pressure of a foot, carefully testing an old weathered floorboard. The sound seemed to float down from the ceiling, quiet but distinct, cutting through the low hum of the movie Sarah had been absorbed in. Her body tensed as her eyes instinctively flicked upward, scanning the plastered ceiling as if she could see through it into the room above. Emily's bedroom was directly overhead, and for a moment, Sarah's mind tried to rationalize the noise. But Emily wasn't home. She had left that morning for her business trip and wouldn't be back for days. The house was old, with its fair share of creaks and groans that came with age. Sarah had grown accustomed to the occasional strange noises, the way the wood would shift and settle as the temperature dropped, or the wind picked up outside. She had learned to tune them out, letting the quirks of the house fade into the background of daily life. For a moment she did the same now, brushing off the sound as nothing more than the house stretching its tired bones. It was probably just the usual shifting of old beams or the wind squeezing through unseen cracks in the walls. With a deep breath, she settled back into the couch, trying to shake off the sudden twinge of unease that had crept into her chest. But then it happened again. A deliberate, slow creak, followed by what sounded like footsteps. Sarah sat up, her heart beginning to race. She muted the TV and strained to listen. For a few seconds, there was nothing but the patter of rain against the windows. Then, a low thud directly above her. A chill ran down her spine. She stood, slowly, her eyes locked on the ceiling. The house was supposed to be empty. Another thud. Her hand instinctively reached for her phone, fingers trembling as they wrapped around the familiar device. She quickly unlocked it, the cold glow from the screen casting eerie shadows on her face. Emily's contact was already at the top of her recent calls, and Sarah's thumb hovered over the name. For a split second, she considered calling her. Hearing Emily's voice might calm the rising panic gnawing at her insides. But then reality sunk in. No, she thought, shaking her head slightly. Emily is hours away. Calling her wouldn't change anything. Sarah's thumb wavered, then slowly moved away from the screen, her hand lowering as her heart raced faster. The creeping dread told her she couldn't just stand there. She had to do something, but she wasn't sure what. The logical part of her brain urged her to dismiss the sounds as nothing. An old house in the middle of the night, that's all it was. Yet her gut screamed otherwise. Steeling herself, Sarah pocketed her phone and turned toward the stairs. Her every movement was deliberate, cautious, as if any sudden noise might provoke something lurking in the shadows. She could feel the blood pounding in her ears, each beat like a countdown. Her breath came shallow and shaky, barely more than soft gasps. She tiptoed toward the base of the staircase, her socked feet making no sound on the worn wooden floor. The air felt heavier with each step she took, like the house itself was watching her, waiting for her next move. As she neared the bottom of the staircase, a faint rustling sound drifted down from above, like the soft crumpling of fabric or the gentle brushing of something against the floor. The sound was so subtle at first that Sarah almost thought she had imagined it. But it was there, undeniable now, and it seemed to come from somewhere deep within the shadows upstairs. Her pulse quickened, the sudden thumping in her chest drowning out all other sounds. A cold prickle of fear crawled up her spine, making the tiny hairs on her neck stand on end. There was no mistaking it. Something, or worse, someone, was upstairs. Her breath caught in her throat as she stood frozen at the base of the stairs, her hand gripping the banister tightly. She hesitated, fear tugging at her every instinct to turn and run. But the rustling continued, soft but persistent, like a whisper daring her to investigate. Against her better judgment, Sarah knew she had to go up. She had to find out what, or who, was making that sound. Swallowing the knot of fear lodged in her throat, she took her first step onto the staircase. The wood groaned beneath her weight, the creak loud and accusing in the stillness of the house. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the very air around her was thickening with each cautious movement upward. Her heart pounded faster, her legs growing weak with every inch she climbed. The distance between her and whatever was waiting above seemed to shrink too quickly, yet the top of the stairs felt impossibly far away. As she ascended, she held her breath, afraid that even the slightest exhale would disturb the fragile silence that clung to the dark corners of the house. When she reached the top, the hallway stretched before her, dark and silent, except for Emily's door at the far end. It was slightly ajar. Sarah was sure Emily had closed it before she left. Her breath caught in her throat as the door creaked open wider, as though pushed by an invisible hand.
"Emily?"
she whispered, even though she knew it was impossible. No answer, only silence. She stepped forward, the floor beneath her groaning with each movement. As she reached Emily's room, Sarah pushed the door fully open, revealing the room exactly as it had been left. Neat, untouched. But something was off. The window. It was open, the curtains gently swaying in the breeze. Had Emily forgotten to close it? Sarah walked toward the window, peering out into the dark yard below. Nothing, just rain-soaked grass. As she turned to leave, something caught her eye. In the corner of the room, barely visible in the shadows, was a small object on the floor. She crouched down and picked it up. It was a crumpled piece of paper. Unfolding it, her eyes widened as she read the message, written in shaky, uneven handwriting.
"I see you."
The paper slipped from her fingers, her stomach twisting in knots. A cold breeze swept through the room, and suddenly she heard it. Breathing. Not hers, but someone else's. Slow, deliberate breaths just behind her. Sarah spun around, her heart hammering in her chest. The room was empty. There was no one there. But the breathing continued. She backed out of the room, her mind racing. Had someone been living in the house without them knowing? She stumbled down the hallway, her legs weak with fear, the sound of footsteps following her down the stairs. She didn't dare look back. She grabbed her keys and bolted for the front door. Just as she reached it, she froze. From the darkness of the hallway, something whispered her name.
"Sarah."
The voice was low, barely audible, but unmistakable. It was coming from right behind her. She turned the doorknob with shaking hands, threw the door open, and sprinted out into the pouring rain, not daring to look back. She drove to a friend's house and stayed there for the rest of the night, too terrified to return. When Emily came back a few days later, Sarah told her everything. Emily checked the house from top to bottom, but nothing was out of place. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of anyone else having been inside. The note Sarah found was gone. To this day, Sarah refuses to spend the night in that house, alone. She never heard the voice again, but she can't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching her that night, from the shadows, waiting for her to turn around.